day, friends. My name is Dan George, and I am your host of Reconciliation Road, an exciting new podcast I have started with the support of the First Nations Major Projects Coalition. The focus of our program is reconciliation in all its forms. Reconciliation has no meaning if it is not aimed at achieving equality in life expectancy, education, employment, and all the important measurable areas of disadvantage. We cannot think of Canada as reconciled when some continue to experience racism and when there continues to be such profound disparity between First Nations people and the wider community. Reconciliation is about creating equity and equality, closing this gap and building relationships to do this. We well know that leadership matters, particularly when it comes to reconciliation. It is essential in every sector, in every community, and in every country. In these times of unprecedented change, organizations, communities, and governments need more leaders, and now more than ever, we need leaders who can unite and mobilize others in a common cause. In our BC healthcare system, we have the Office of the Provincial Health Officer, a team that is tasked with overseeing the health of British Columbians and advising on public health concerns and situations to our ministers and public bodies. Be kind, be calm, be safe is something the Office of the Provincial Health Officer is also known for now, words many British Columbians became familiar with during the pandemic, words that still ring true today. This sentiment comes from our Provincial Health Officer, Dr. Bonnie Henry, and her team, a sort of slogan now for many people across our province. Today, we are so very grateful to have both Dr. Bonnie Henry, BC Provincial Health Officer, and Dr. Daniéle Behn-Smith, Deputy Provincial Health Officer, Indigenous Health, with us, two pivotal figures in the health and wellness of citizens in BC today, and it's not lost on me that these two pivotal figures are women. They have worked tirelessly through the pandemic, devoting themselves to protecting the citizens of BC, and are monumental in the efforts to improve access to equal health care and wellness for Indigenous communities. Our province is at a turning point in how we address racism and colonial views intertwined with our healthcare system, and Dr. Bonnie Henry and Dr. Behn-Smith are both playing important roles in this shift and how the future of equal access to healthcare and community wellness will look for Indigenous peoples in British Columbia moving forward. I would be remiss if I didn't begin by acknowledging and raising my hands in respect and admiration to each of you for the work that you've done on behalf of British Columbians and Canadians. And I'm not surprised that it's women that are leading this charge. I want to raise my hands in respect to you and just to amplify all of your skills and abilities that have been on display for all of us for months and months and months now. So thank you very much. Your office has spoken to the disproportionate discrimination Indigenous peoples face in BC's healthcare system and how the pandemic has highlighted this. Dr. Henry, can you speak to how your partnership with Dr. Behn-Smith has benefited the province's work in connecting with Indigenous communities and to address the stigmatization and barriers experienced by Indigenous people in accessing equal healthcare in BC? So what ideas do you have there, Dr. Henry?
You know, just from the very beginning, and so Danielle, I'm very grateful, has been part of our office for, I want to say, 5 years now. And so we've been on this journey together prior to this pandemic. And I also want to acknowledge that we have a very strong relationship between our office and the First Nations Health Authority and Métis Nation BC that we've cultivated through the leadership of Dr. Behn-Smith as well. And that has meant that as we went into this pandemic, we were all very aware that pandemics historically have always differentially affected First Nations people, Métis people, Inuit people, and that we needed to take that into account in everything that we did in responding to this pandemic. And that is something that I've learned that you know, we need to privilege the knowledge. And it was Elder Pauline Waterfall, who said, we talk about unprecedented, but for First Nations people, this is not unprecedented. It is indeed precedented. And those words really stuck with me. And she talked about how in every pandemic in recorded history, First Nations people have have been differentially negatively affected, but have also shown their resilience and strength and knowledge and wisdom, and that we needed to use that to work together through this. So those are things that have underpinned our work, particularly during the pandemic. And there's been many, many examples where we've done this early on. One of the simple things that I did after we declared a public health emergency was compel the linking of data. And that sounds like a very simple thing, but data on who is being infected, what the outcomes are, how people are being treated, are they able to access care? All of those things are important things to help us know where to put resources. And so we linked our case information about who is getting sick with COVID with the First Nations client file, which is an imperfect tool, but it is a tool that we have, and one of the only tools that we have that allows us to collect disaggregated information by First Nations status. So, and that information was compelled by the traditional legal framework that we worked under, but we gave it, or it was under the stewardship of the First Nations Health Authority and under the stewardship of the leaders of First Nations, so that that information went to them first and was controlled by them and used by them. And it was my job to make sure that we responded to that. And so that's one really important thing that I think has made a difference in helping understand the impacts on First Nations communities in particular. And then we did a similar linkage with Métis Nation BC so that we could understand the impact on Métis people in British Columbia. So it's a simple thing, but I think it is important that we put that forward as something that we needed to do, and it was prioritized to do early on. And Danielle, you can, it has been, it's been a learning experience for me in every sense of the word. And as Danielle has taught me, reconciliation is messy. But it's the work that we need to do. And it's about building relationships. It's about talking through these things, and it's about building trust. And there have been many, many times where I've had to step back and check why I'm thinking a certain way, or why I react a certain way to the way things happen, and fall back on the wisdom that I have learned from others about that relationship, and not trying to fit other people's beliefs and understandings and learnings and wisdoms into my box of how I think about things.
Dr. Behn Smith, did you want to jump in on that as well?
Yeah, thank you so much. And it's so nice to be a part of the conversation today. And I think Bonnie's absolutely right that we've discovered time and again over the course of the pandemic that reconciliation is hard work, it can be messy work, and it's work that we need to do every day. And that we need to demonstrate, as Bonnie was just saying, building trust by demonstrating our trustworthiness. So that's something that's been so critically important. And I'm not sure that all people living in British Columbia really appreciate how privileged we are to have Dr. Henry in her role at this time, not just from a pandemic perspective, because in so many ways, the way that I see it, her career sort of just was following a trajectory to have her in this role at the perfect time. So,
it wasn't my fault. I didn't bring it.
No. But just all of her professional experiences, working on with the World Health Organization on pandemic preparedness, and having been at the front line of SARS. And so knowing that she came to this role with this incredible wisdom and expertise around pandemics, which really has benefited all people living in British Columbia. But for those of us who are coming into this pandemic as Indigenous peoples, for myself having roots as an Daniéle woman and a Métis woman, you know, having Dr. Henry in this role with her steadfast commitment to arresting racism and to illuminating and being open to illuminating the way that white supremacy as an inherited structure and framework really does continue to fuel and create and perpetuate those inequities. The fact that she's brave enough and courageous enough to take on that work every day has been, you know, something that I have so much admiration and respect for, because it is really challenge, or it can be very challenging work when you're pushing against structures and systems and policies, especially at a time of crisis. But I've been really lucky to work with somebody who I think really does live and breathe reconciliation, not as as an add-on or something additional, but something that is core to the way that she approaches the work.
Thank you. And you mentioned this work is hard work, it's messy work, Daniéle, and I want to acknowledge you as well for the great work that you do. My niece is becoming a doctor. Dr. Randy George is my niece, and she's from the UNBC medical program, and it's people like you that inspired her, right? So I want to acknowledge you and the dynamic team of yourself and Dr. Henry, that ability for two-eyed seeing, right? The ability to balance the Western and the traditional knowledge and to be nimble and adaptable. So I wanted to, you're very kind, Daniéle, but I also wanted to pump up your tires a little bit as well, right? So great work, and thank you for being a role model for so many young Indigenous men and women. So thank you for that.
Oh, your niece is a powerhouse. She's an incredible, incredible human, and I'm really in awe of the work that she's doing. So thank you for that. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, and she's my wife and I's goddaughter as well, and we have great admiration and respect for the sacrifices that she's making, and the unselfish contribution that all of you in the medical system have for the rest of us. So thank you for that. Dr. Bonnie Henry, you spoke a little bit to this, but I want to just pose a question to you, Daniéle. Indigenous peoples and cultures have had to endure extreme impacts of pandemics as a direct result of colonization. Can you explain how the historical experiences Indigenous peoples have had with disease and connection to the current day realities, such as poor health outcomes, the rural, remote communities, the overcrowded housing that we have, which is very difficult to address, particularly with the pandemic, and just lower overall socioeconomic statuses, right? So how do you bring that to the table in a way that is meaningful, that allows people to have that understanding and empathy that they need to, walk a mile in our moccasins, if you will?
Yeah, that's such a great question, Dan. And, I think one of the greatest joys that I've had in this role is collaborating with the First Nations Health Authority and their Office of the Chief Medical Officer. And before the pandemic, we had done some work on the population health and wellness agenda, and I would encourage your listeners to check it out. There is a visualization or a drawing that's in that report that shows an ecosystem metaphor that really captures in one snapshot all of the things that we need as First Nations, and I believe as Inuit, as Métis peoples, all the things we need to be healthy, vibrant, and self-determining. And so the image has a group of First Nations family that's out on the land harvesting medicines. It's a really beautiful image. And then under that soil from where all those plant medicines are growing, there's a lot of roots. And so when we think about what do we need to be well, those deepest roots, the things we ultimately need is the freedom to be ourselves. Fully as who we are, as Dene, as Métis, as Wet'suwet'en. It's our culture, our language, our lands, our families, our communities, our nations. We need those deepest roots to be nourished and abundant. And we need the self-determination and jurisdiction to keep those things in abundance. And then in the shallower soil, so just above those deep roots, we need to have supportive mainstream systems that we can interact with in a good way and get our needs met. So that means we need education, justice, healthcare, child welfare. We need those systems to be free of racism. We need them to be culturally safe. We need to see ourselves in those systems in order to get our needs met. And when both of those roots of wellness, those shallower kind of mainstream system roots, and then those deeper roots of who we are, our identity, our connection to our ancestors, when those things are well nourished, then we flourish in mind, body, and spirit. And so that image was such a powerful anchor for me as we went into COVID-19, because all of a sudden it really illuminated the specific threats that this virus was posing for us as Indigenous peoples. As you mentioned, you know, we as Indigenous peoples were at greater risk of getting COVID in the first place, because as a result of systemic and persistent racism and social exclusion, we have not gotten our needs met from housing systems, from the justice system. So we are in situations in disproportionate numbers where we're in overcrowded situations, living situations where we might be overrepresented in jails and being incarcerated. So right out of the gates, we were at a higher risk of possibly getting COVID. And then when we think about that specific virus and the threat that it posed, we also realized that, you know, we were at higher risk of developing severe COVID, or, you know, ending up in hospital, or unfortunately dying of COVID, again, because as a result of systemic racism and discrimination, we came into the pandemic with higher rates of chronic disease. And then I think one of the greatest threats, and the thing that you know, that many of us carried as one of the biggest fears in our hearts, was that this is a virus that is particularly hard on elderly people. That's where age is the biggest risk factor for death. Elders are the heartbeat of our community. They hold our language, our teachings, our ceremonies. There are knowledge keepers. And so this virus in particular was, you know, a real significant threat to our cultural continuity. And so going back to your question about, you know, thinking historically about pandemics, disease, our experiences in the healthcare system, you know, I really believe that we came out as a public health system, and I believe that the province came out to do the right thing and prioritize us and our families for vaccination, because these vaccines are good medicines that are the primary tool, the best way we have to protect ourselves from COVID-19. And I also know that because of our lived experience, and because we live in a country that is deeply rooted in ideologies of white supremacy that for, you know, decades and hundreds of years actively have tried to extinguish us as Indigenous peoples, we understandably have significant mistrust. You know, I have members of my own family who have not yet been vaccinated. because they just said flat out, this doesn't seem right to me. The fact that they've put us first in line, they're experimenting on us, as they did and have done in the past. So these beliefs, while I know that today it's not true because I have the privilege of being in this position and I get to be a part of those conversations and see how the decisions are being made, I know that this decision about vaccines has been made from a really good place, not about hurting us, but about actually upholding our Indigenous rights to have access to those good medicines to protect us. I also know that there are people in our own community, as I say, in my own family, who are still so understandably mistrustful of the system as a whole, that they have concerns about the vaccines. If I can maybe just finish on this with this one thought, because the way that I see it, I actually think that going out and getting these vaccines as an Indigenous person is the ultimate act of resistance, because there's so much work to be done. And I really love your podcast and the fact that you're having these conversations to, help all of us understand, like, there's so much work to do. And as Indigenous peoples, I think one of our most important roles, and one of the things that guides me is thinking about my daughters and holding our systems, our governments, holding their feet to the fire and making sure that they are accountable and they uphold our treaty rights. And it's very simple. In order to do that important work of holding folks like Dr. Henry accountable, which she has done, and she's shown up every day to do that, but we need to be here and be strong and healthy. We cannot let a now preventable illness, a preventable harms from a virus, to keep us as Indigenous peoples from doing that important work of continuing to demand that our rights be upheld. And so that's why, for me, I actually twist that that fear and mistrust of the vaccines to say, actually, no, these are good medicines that we actually need to take, because we need to be here to be a part of doing this important work. So I hope that if there's anybody listening today who hasn't yet gone to take their vaccine, that this might shift their way of thinking a little bit and help boost their confidence that these are really good medicines, and that we should totally take advantage of our rights. For me, as a Treaty 8 descendant, that's my treaty right to be first in line to get those medicines. I certainly was, my daughters were when their age cohort came up. So I hope other folks will also, make that choice, not just for us now and the future, but, when I think about the pandemics in the past that decimated our communities, that decimated communities, that that extinguished languages, like just that the loss of those, that's the sacredness that was lost. I actually think that going to get these vaccines, these medicines, is another really important way for us to honor our ancestors and the ones that were lost in previous pandemics, sometimes deliberately. As we know, infectious diseases were used as a military warfare tactic. Sometimes it was just as a part of that, global pandemic that was happening. But today, this is the first pandemic where I think we can stand up as Indigenous peoples and really embrace the fact that this is an opportunity for us to honor our ancestors, honor ourselves, our descendants, by taking these good medicines. Masi.
Masi, and I really appreciate, I haven't heard it being referenced or referred to as an act of resistance, but I really appreciate that, Dr. Behn Smith. And getting vaccinated. We're not going anywhere as Indigenous people. Like we've been here for millennia. We're going to be here for millennia into the future. And the systemic change that we need is required to make space, as you say, for our Indigenous ways of knowing, being, seeing, and doing. And I know that children and people flourish, particularly when they have a strong sense of identity and a strong sense of belonging, right? So again, I really appreciate the comment about the active resistance, because I'm all about the resistance, right? Recently,
Oh, sorry, I was just going to say, didn't mean to interrupt. Just how important it is as a sense of, I know the image very well that Danielle was talking about, and it's that sense of community, and it's that sense of community that has kept people strong through this. But it also is that sense of community that means that I take my vaccine for me, but also for my elders and for my children and for the future of that community. And I hear that so much from Danielle, but from other First Nations and Métis people that I have conversations with. And that's so important.
Yeah, it's a duty. It's an obligation that I believe that I had as the grandfather in my family, that I needed to provide that level of leadership. And, certainly I had my reservations about it, but I relied upon people who are trained in this area. And I looked at all of the information and I made the decision for me that I should get vaccinated, and I encourage others to do the same. And I work really hard not to get into debates about it, because it's can become very polarizing within our communities. I want to speak a little bit about climate change, and it was really interesting. We've had the heat domes, we've had floods, we've had wildfires, we've had COVID-19, and I'm starting to see that some doctors are starting to say some of the results are it's due to climate change, right? And because of the heat domes, the floods, and the wildfires, BC as a province, we're burning through money. And everything the province continuously talks about is the economy, right? And healthy environments and community well-being hinge upon a functioning economy. So in your role, Dr. Henry, how do you balance the needs of the economy with patient well-being and public health? As a public health officer, is your duty to save every patient possible, or does your role also include a duty to the economic well-being of British Columbia?
Well, this is a really, really important question. And, you talk about all that we have been through in this province in the past year and a half. And I mean, who ever heard of heat domes and atmospheric rivers and the wildfires and then the pandemic? And it sometimes seems, it seems like we can't get a break, and it can be very whelming for people. And I also, where I come from, I'm a settler, but I grew up in Mi'kmaq territory in Prince Edward Island, and we have this saying that common suffering builds strong bonds. And I hope that these bonds are all of us together in this province, because we have supported each other, and where we have worked as communities, regardless of who we are, and made that difference, it has got us through this. And when I think of, is it health or is it the economy? And it's not one or the other, it's both. And if this pandemic has shown us anything, it's that the economy suffers if people aren't healthy, and people can't be healthy. The effects of poverty, of unemployment, of not being in school, also affect our health, our mental health, our physical health, our emotional health. And we saw that especially dramatically when children were out of school. We heard across the board in our survey that we did of people, no matter where they lived, no matter what income they had, that children being out of school was catastrophic for families and communities. And no more so for Indigenous communities, more so for racialized communities, more so for women than men. and more so for people who are in lower income or live in poverty, because not having children in school has so many detrimental effects on parents being able to work, on their own education and health and mental health. So those were some of the things that that we prioritized, and one of the things I'm most proud of is that we had children in school, back in school full time starting in June of last year. And that has been something that we have prioritized, not only because, I mean, it's good for kids to be in school and they need to learn, but it's because it's mental health and emotional health and physical health and economic health. And we know that interpersonal and interrelationship, interfamily violence happens more commonly when parents are unemployed. All of these things go together. So it's not one or the other. And I think what we are seeing around climate change tells us that as well. Our interactions, and here again, we go back to some of the models, and I think again of the image that we have with the First Nations health report that we did, where it is all intertwined. And I think to their credit, our government here has seen that it's not the pandemic or the economy. It's that we have to find that tricky balance. And part of that was my job was, how much is just enough restriction? And, I had these conversations with ethicists about this over many years, but at the beginning of this pandemic, and, the ethical decision is to do just enough restriction. But when you're dealing with an unknown virus and all of the other unknowns and uncertainties at the beginning, where just enough is very, very difficult. And I know that people's direct health is affected if we don't do a bit too much early on. But then we try to find that balance, and we've never shut everything down. And sometimes we've been asked to. We've tried to find the way to keep people working as much as possible, but with safety measures in place, with additional things for this, as we learned about what the things made a difference for this pandemic. So it is trying to walk that tightrope of, the pure science, the pure COVID, but the societal consequences of the things that we do to try and manage the pandemic, and finding a balance in those. And I think if anything, we have seen that whole, the pandemic has exposed those inequities that have existed for a long time, that most of us in the Western world have not seen, from my perspective. And again, it goes back to the white supremacy issue, the framework that we built all of our legal systems on, and the fact that the people working in our poultry plants were most at risk, and they couldn't take time off because they had no sick leave. That we had many people working in multiple different long-term care facilities, being undervalued and paid a wage difference of sometimes $14 an hour difference in their wages. So these are all inequities that have been exposed, and we've talked already about the inequities that have been long-standing in First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities as well. So it's not either or, it's dealing with both of them. And this is one of the things that I'm looking at. How do we can't unsee what we've seen. And I use this a lot. Rachel Carson, who wrote a really great book, Silent Spring, about environmental issues a number of years ago. She says, most of us walk unseen through this world, unaware alike of its beauties and the tragic intensity of the lives being lived around us. We've seen that now, and we've seen the impact of health on the economy, and the economy on the climate. It is not a surprise to me that people who died during the heat dome were people who lived in certain urban environments where there was less green space, where there's less access to air conditioning. And it's not a surprise to us that there are communities that were more differentially affected by the flooding. So these are all things that we need to pack in and think about as we're hopefully at some point really going into recovery. recovery from the pandemic, recovery from the tragedies that have hit us, and not forget those bonds that we have and that we've seen this. So I don't know all the answers, but I think if we continue to realize that these are all connected circles, it's what's going to help us take those perspectives out of this.
Mm-hmm. And just on that point, we've heard about the phrases "build back better," and I think part of any kind of change is the unknown, the uncertainty, which begins to give people anxiety, right?
Oh yes.
And we've heard again this new normal. What's realistic for us to look forward to achieving in the near future? Like, again, all of our lives have been so disrupted. When will we get back to some sense of normalcy, do you think, Doctor?
I think we have to define what normal is again. We can't unlive this either, right? And it has affected all of us and globally. And another analogy that I use all the time is we're in a storm globally, the same storm, but we're not all in the same boat. And so we have to recognize that.
Mm-hmm.
And these concepts of building back better or new normal, I really think we don't want to go back to what we thought was normal. And this is an opportunity where we've been so disrupted to say, what should it look like? And I think, I'm not an economist, obviously, but when you think about the impacts that the economy but we can see that that there are some changes that have been positive. And so how do we find those positive changes and build on those? Things like the recognition that sick leave is important.
Mm-hmm.
That's a small one. Recognition that wage differentials in some of these critical areas are mean that people are more disadvantaged when something like this happens. So how do we take those and create a normal that builds on the bonds that we have? So I can think of, my head is spinning a little bit because I can think of many, many different ways. And of course, my focus is health and public health. And, how does we build a public health system that is more resilient, that is able to deal with, I talk about how we're one deep in public health. And because when you're working on prevention and when we're doing our job really well behind the scenes, people aren't getting sick. So there's no need for us to have 2 or 3 people doing a certain thing. But I see these are not going to stop. And it's the same people that are responding to, the flooding of the drinking water systems. And what are you going to do with the food in your fridge because the power's been out because of the storms, or that you've been evacuated because of the wildfires? And how do you deal with the smoke? And are doing the contact tracing for the COVID outbreaks and managing outbreaks and providing vaccines. So I think, we have to look at it's a time to be disruptive and to build it back together in a way that is more just.
Yeah, and you've been very, very adept and nimble in terms of, your communication with British Columbians. And many of us, and I'm sure yourselves as well, we're all getting some kind of COVID fatigue and like, what now, right? And, we continually encourage people to get double vaccinated. We encourage them to get their booster shots. We have another variant that's out right now. Why should we be concerned about the variant? And people are saying, there'll probably be 2 more variants before Christmas, right?
Probably not before Christmas, but I hope. But viruses do that. That's how they exist in this world. They replicate, and every time they change, they have a teeny bit of genetic material relative to humans. So every time it changes, and it's what we call an RNA. So it's a single strand of genetic material, and we have DNA, which is a double strand of genetic material. So when you only have that single strand, it doesn't have a spell check. So it changes all the time. These mutations arise, and it's only when it's spreading a lot between a lot of people, and there's hundreds and thousands and millions and billions of this virus replicating in people or in animals, that you start to probabilistically get a mutation that gives it some sort of survival advantage. And that's what we've seen all along. So the answer really is a global vaccine equity. And once we get a level of immunity in everybody around the globe, the potential for one of these really different strains that gives it some sort of survival advantage to take off goes down dramatically. And that's when we start to get back into the post-pandemic, endemic living with this virus phase. So as much as I said it, and it's exactly a year, I think December 15th was our first vaccine clinic. And how many times have I said get vaccinated? It's in the thousands. It's almost as many times as I said wash your hands, wear a mask. But we are going to get to that point where we live with this. It does mean that I believe that at some point soon in the coming months, the booster dose is making a huge difference, especially for our seniors and elders whose immune systems aren't as strong and don't mount a strong immune response. And I was just looking at the data before we had our call today, and we're starting to see in 70 and over dramatic decreases, which is just warms my heart. But we also, so we need to learn how to live with it like we do many other things, which means there'll be certain times of the year, there's a seasonality to this virus. Certain times of the year, we'll have to be more careful about washing our hands and covering our mouth and staying away from others when we're sick, and wearing masks in those indoor settings, opening windows, making sure we have that ventilation, and protecting those people who are most at risk.
Dr. Daniéle Behn-Smith was very kind in her comments about you earlier, Dr. Henry, when she says you've shown up every day. And I want to submit that Dr. Behn-Smith, you've shown up every day as well. And what are you two doing to take care of yourselves? Like, you're in such a high pressure situation, and I do a bunch of work in the public, and one of the things that I really struggle with is that if I'm in a room with 100 people and 99 people say I did a good job and one person starts to criticize me, all I remember is the one person who criticized me, right? So how are you ladies going through your days, maintaining this optimism, this calm, cool, collected approach? What are you doing to take care of yourselves, and you continue to show up to serve in the face of such tremendous challenges?
You don't see us behind the scenes. You don't see me going,
Yeah. I agree. I was going to say, I think it is important to dispel the myth that we are keeping it together consistently over the last 2 years, because we're human too. I'm not convinced that Bonnie's fully human. I think she may have some advantageous genetic material. But I mean, I've had many low points over the course of the pandemic. It has strained me as it has everybody else. And so some days I'll peek at Bonnie's calendar, and that helps me feel better when I want to feel sorry for myself. And I think, oh no, it could be worse. But in all seriousness, the medicines that keep our, that we hold and have the benefit of coming from our elders. So I think about balance. I, try and stay grounded. On really hard days, I'll pull on my grandma's mutt clucks that she gifted me when I graduated from medical school if I need an extra boost of strength. And just trying to focus on the here and now and the things that I can control. And in some moments, it's just the breathing. And I would say, that some of the hardest points for me have been when we've been like tackling some of the reconciliation pieces head on. And, we worked really, really hard with a coalition of nations with President Sayers from Nuu-Chonlith Tribal Council, Chief Slett from Heltzik, and Jay Nelson representing Chilcotin to negotiate an information sharing agreement. And that was tough work. And it was really hard to kind of create space to uphold First Nations self-determination. And at the end, nobody was particularly satisfied with the final agreement other than it was signed. But, there's so much work to do. And that was a particularly hard time because, it just brought into question, my role and my impact in the role, and am I doing enough? And so those were hard moments where I remember distinctly one night kind of like being in tears, and then I had this real epiphany where I thought, oh my gosh, because I was praying to the Creator, and then it struck me. I said, oh my gosh, like I asked to do this work. Like I wanted to work in service of reconciliation, but sometimes it's just hard and it gets you a little bit down. But yeah, balance, prayer, and then being able to work alongside somebody who really does, work so hard to keep her own balance too. So those have been good medicines for me over the last couple of years.
And I cannot say enough how much I appreciate the wisdom and the support from Danielle and the support we give each other. And I owe her a decade worth of lattes that she and her daughters bring me when in need. But it has been hard. It's been very hard mentally and emotionally. And I know somebody was saying to me, we were talking about it, and maybe it was you and I, Danielle, I can't remember, but I've cried pretty much every day for 2 years because it is, and it's one of the ways that I let things go. And but it is so important, and I've learned how important it is that language matters and words matter, and how we say them is. And it is my lot in life, as it were, right now, to be that face of the face and the voice of a very strong team of people. And I want to do to honor that and do justice to it. So that's what keeps me going. But I am an introvert, and if it wasn't for my job, I think I would be quite happy during this pandemic, hiding out at home and reading books and listening to music. But it has been hard, and there's been some personal challenges. Danielle and I both, but particularly me, because I've been the face and the voice, and I've received death threats and some very nasty things. And I'm now a threesome. I don't go anywhere without my RCMP protective detail, which is comforting, but also very limiting in one's life and challenging. And so we have a strong team, and that makes all the difference. And trying to stay grounded and trying to remember that we have a really important role to support ourselves, so that we can support our community too.
You ladies are superhuman, and we are so privileged here in the province of British Columbia to have both of you leading the charge per se on behalf of all of us with regards to the pandemic. Lots of pressures on the healthcare system that you've noted. People are burnt out within the profession. Many of them might be contemplating leaving the profession. What do you say to people to keep them encouraged and motivated, and particularly to some of those young men and women out there that should be pursuing a career in the medical profession? What light can you shed on them about why it would be important to serve in that capacity?
Want to start, Danielle?
Sure. Yeah, I think, I just think there's so many people that have been working so hard in service over the last 2 years. And I know we've talked about the healthcare professionals, but this is the first time that I've gotten to even bear witness a little bit more closely to First Nations leadership in action. And so I'm just thinking of that, a kind of that broader question of, you know, just calling people to be of service to those around you. And I think there's so many different ways. I went into medicine because I really did want to be a part of supporting Indigenous health and wellness. And that was over 20 years ago now. And knowing what I know now, I think there's so many other ways that we can support Indigenous health and wellness. It doesn't necessarily have to be down a healthcare professional path. And I say that because I've watched our leaders step up time and again to support us and our families and our kin. And it's been hard work for them as well, not just facing COVID, but all of the other challenges, overdose, and as we've mentioned, the wildfires. So I think what I would say to somebody who's just starting out on their journey is finding that sense of purpose can get you through really hard times and challenges that you might think feel insurmountable from where you are now, because I'm speaking from experience and knowing that, again, on those low days, just remembering that the reason I get up in the morning is so that people like my family, my loved ones, and people like them, so my relatives and kin from other nations, that when they, you know, go to walk in the doors of a hospital, whether they go in to walk in the doors of a clinic or they're going to get their vaccine, that I wake up every morning hoping that my work will help in some way to make that a positive experience. And so just being grounded in that, that desire to be of service has really helped me get through some really tough times. So yeah, so I hope if there are some listeners who are listening and are in that point in their life of trying to figure out what comes next, I would say definitely there is such a deep sense of satisfaction in being able to do this sacred work. So hopefully they'll decide to pick something that really benefits and gives back to their communities, because that's really what we're all about, right? Is taking care of one another.
I worry. I do worry, as you mentioned, Dan, about people in healthcare professions. I've had the privilege of visiting a number of our ICUs and hospitals around the province when things were really stretched, and that's where I think there's a lot of. I visit my public health teams too, our public health teams, and we talk regularly. But I see the distress and the moral distress in the intensive care units when young people are coming in and needing to be on oxygen or ventilators, and they're unvaccinated. And that's part of the issues that we're seeing more recently. You know, early on, it was all very unknown and fear about us and are we going to take it home to our family? But now it's a preventable illness, and the moral distress that people are feeling about the not being able to support other people who have other healthcare needs. And really what I try and talk to people about is supporting each other, being gentle with each other. And the fact that, as you talked about, Daniéle, that our role as in service, which is, you know, medicine is a service industry, and we are privileged. We call it hospital privileges for a reason. We are privileged to care for people. And how we do that makes a difference in people's lives every single day. And so just reminding people that the way you approach it is so important, and it will give you strength, and it will make it, make it an experience that is helpful and positive for the people you're caring for too. And I just see that over and over again, the heroism of that is out there, even when we're tired, even when there's negativity and frustration. And I'm like you, I mean, every negative thing sits with me all night. And but I think we come to it from a place of wanting to support people, wanting to care for people, wanting to recognize that we are all in this together. And I talk about, this unrelenting uncertainty, and it's hard. We want it to wish it away. We don't want it to be that way right now. But it is. And so we have to take that energy to do the things that protect ourselves, protect our families, protect our community, and replace that uncertainty with unrelenting kindness. And that is my mantra for getting us through this.
I'm blessed to have this opportunity to spend this short while with each of you. I raise my hands again in respect and admiration for all that you do. On behalf of my fellow British Columbians, I want to thank you for your servant leadership. And in this space of reconciliation, you are seeking transformative change in terms of how health is being provided to all of us here. And you want to smash the status quo. The status quo oftentimes is poverty normalized in far too many Indigenous and non-Indigenous homes. So smashing the status quo means striving towards greater equity, greater equality, and greater inclusion. I'm just so thankful that you've taken time to be with us here today. It's taken a little while, right, for us to get our schedules together, but you were here today, and you were on TV yesterday. You'll be on TV today. You'll be on TV tomorrow. And I'm just grateful that we have women like you leading us here in the province of British Columbia. Masi Cho for all that you do.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, Masi Cho, Dan. Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much. In Canada, the process of reconciliation is largely, but not exclusively, tied to the federal government's relationship with Indigenous peoples. The term reconciliation has come to describe attempts made by individuals and institutions to raise awareness about colonization and its ongoing effects on Indigenous peoples. Reconciliation also refers to efforts made to address the harms caused by various policies and programs of colonization, such as residential schools and the Indian Act. For some, the word reconciliation represents an opportunity to reflect on the past, to heal, and to make right. For others, however, current gestures of reconciliation are merely performative and lack meaningful action to address the harms done by colonization. While the word reconciliation continues to mean different things to different people and remains controversial amongst Indigenous people for the lack of accompanying action, reasons for optimism remain. Individual and institutional efforts can lead to meaningful dialogue and efforts to improve the relationship between Indigenous people in Canada and to continue to right historic wrongs in a manner that brings Indigenous people respect for their full rights and appropriate accompanying treatment. Thank you, Drs. Henry and Dr. Behn Smith, for your many years of service coupled with your stellar leadership skills. We know that there are many pressing demands in your schedule, so we very much appreciate you taking the time to be with us on the program. Please join me in future episodes of Reconciliation Road, where I will introduce exciting change agents who are pushing the dial on reconciliation. Until then, stay safe and keep standing in the light. Masi Cho. Thank you.
Reconciliation Road is supported by the First Nations Major Projects Coalition. The FNMPC is a nonprofit organization dedicated to providing free-of-charge resources to First Nations in Canada, supporting their efforts to gain equity ownership stakes in major projects being developed on their traditional territories, while ensuring that the integrity of the land is maintained for the enjoyment of current and future generations. The FNMPC envisions a future where we walk the path of the reconciliation road together. For more information, please visit us at fnmpc.ca.